just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd stopped growing. I was stuck in neutral. And then after that, I came back and I became obsessed with getting back on track and moving in the right direction. If you want family to be your number one priority, you have to write it down, and you have to ask yourself with every decision you make, how is this going to affect my family? Because I realized that I wasn't traveling 2 million miles and doing all that stuff for my family. So now I reset on my core values, and family is now number one. And so everything I ask myself now, every decision I make is, how's this going to affect my family? And it's allowed me to be a lot more present than I have been in the past.
So today we have on John Barrows, who is the CEO of Sell Better by JB Sales, a sales training company. So he's in a similar space to me, but he's someone who's very purpose-driven, spiritual-driven, and he's going to be talking about some topics that are very difficult for him, like the death of his dad, but how he went on a spiritual journey to a place called Sedona, which was a bit of a pilgrimage for him, and the lessons he learned there. So really looking forward to today's conversation. Awesome. So I'm with a mentor, friend, and all-around great guy today, John Barrows. And John works in a similar field to me, and I think I've always looked up to him as he's someone that works in the kind of the field of sales, consulting, trading, but he has this spiritual element to him as well, like myself. And so this is a concept we talked about a lot before, John, so you know what the cosmic bridge is, that thing that connects your professional life, your material side, and your spiritual world, and your profession and your passion. So for you, John Barrows, what is your cosmic bridge?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think ultimately, I did a lot of work recently on my why and my core values and those type of things. And I understand how privileged I am in this life. I don't want to say lucky, because I don't believe in luck, but I definitely believe in privilege. And I think once you recognize that privilege, it's incumbent upon you to share it and with people who might not be as privileged. And sales for me is a career and a profession that I think is the ultimate equalizer, because it really is how hard you work. Don't get me wrong, there's certain advantages still in this field, but the harder you work, typically the more you get paid, and you can have the freedom to do what you want. And so for me, I've always wanted to pay it forward, help out people who are less privileged than I, and I think sales is a means to be able to do that.
Awesome. So you said something there around privilege, and I guess you could relate that to gratitude as well. Would you say that's part of it? You feel like gratitude for the life that you have?
Oh, absolutely. You follow probably Gary Vaynerchuk just like I do. And, he's got that whole thing that he went on a year ago where it's like a 7 billion chances or whatever it is that to become a human being born in America, like the fact that you're even alive in today's world and not a tree, that type of thing. I have a lot of gratitude for it. And, I wake up every morning thankful for what I have. And, and I think a lot of people, for some reason, this world beats you up quite a bit as far as negativity and paying attention to the outside world. But I try to just focus on the stuff that I can control. My daughter and I have this little saying, it's EAT, right? And it's to focus on what you can control, and it's effort, attitude, and how you treat people. And to me, I think if you focus on the stuff that you can control, and try to limit the stuff that you can't, you become a lot more open to gratitude, and you become a lot more grateful, I think, for what's around you when you start looking for the positive as opposed to the negative.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're mentioning around like the things you focus on, the things you can control and not the things you can't. And that's obviously something they talk about in like Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've had relatives that have been through that, and I've looked at what they've said, and it's actually something that we can all apply to our own lives. But I thought I'd take it back to like your job, and you run this sales training company. And I think that's also something that's important for like salespeople, or really in any type of profession, whatever job you do. So say you're working with salespeople, how do you help them with that? Obviously you talked about doing it with your daughter, but when it comes to like your clients as well, how do you help them focus on only the things they can control and not the things that they can't?
It's tough because you kind of have to care first. I think that's the part that is the hardest part for me. But once you care, man, I can give you all the tips in the world and techniques on how to really stay focused and create a routine around things. But I think the biggest challenge is more getting people to care. I think there's so many people going through the motions in this life. And, I call it the give a shit factor. It's let's go back to the Alcoholics Anonymous. You cannot help an alcoholic unless the alcoholic comes and says, I need help. Right? Like, we have all the best intentions. Oh, this person's in trouble. We're going to help them out. We're going to do this. Da, 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 da. But if they haven't gotten to the point in their life internally where they're like, shit, I need help, and I'm going to ask for it and I'm going to be open for it, you can't help them. And it's the same thing with sales reps. Like, if a sales rep is just looking at this as a job for a commission check to pay the bills, they're just going to go through the motions. They're going to get caught up in bad commission plans. They're going to get caught up in, I have a shitty territory, and it's going to be excuse after excuse after excuse. There's literally nothing I can do about that. And quite frankly, nothing I really want to do about that. Like, I mean, I can provide them a lighthouse, if you will, of what you could be like, and try to throw out some positivity out there. But until you come to the point where you're like, I want to work on this, I want to get better, and I want to focus on what I can control, it's hard to. So I think a lot of examples of people who have gone through really bad situations and come out of them and been successful. That's why on my podcast, I interview a lot of people who kind of, I don't say rags to riches, but really were struggling in some way, shape, or form, and really were not given dealt a good hand, if you will, and somehow, some way scraped and clawed their way to a better life. And I think just by having maybe those conversations out loud more often, that some people might see themselves in that person and how they were negative. I mean, like Ian Cognac's a great example. Ian, he was a really good rep. And then he was selling SMB and mid-market stuff. And then he went to the enterprise at Salesforce, failed miserably. And also talks about it openly, was addicted to all sorts of stuff, strip clubs and strippers and all this other stuff. And it was like, and he decided one day to change, that this wasn't working for him. And he revamped everything. And now he talks about it, on his podcast, on his coaching sessions and everything else. And I think he provides a great example of somebody who, things were happening to him and all this other stuff. And he rose above it because he changed his mindset. And I firmly believe there's two types of people in this world. There's people who life happens to, and there's people who life happens for. The people who life happens to are the people that everything is an excuse. Oh, the economy. Oh, the competitor cheated to get the deal. Or, oh, this commission plan sucks for me. And, oh, I'm not going to be able to hit my target. That's the people who life happens to. People who life happens for, when they get a shitty commission plan or a new commission plan, they don't bitch about it. They look about, okay, well, how can I maximize my commission plan? If they get a crappy territory, they look at it as a challenge, not, oh, woe is me. And so I think that, unfortunately, I think there's more people in the life happens to category than there is the life happens for. But once you make that mind shift, and it's another interesting one where, here's another example of, I think, I don't know if it was Steve Jobs or Elon who said this, that once you realize it's a lot easier to make $10,000 than it is to save $10,000, your life changes, right? Because everybody's like, oh, let me, I gotta tighten my belt here. I gotta save some money. But think about trying to save $10,000 here for a second, Michael, right? Like, if you're trying to save $10,000, you're going to go through a line item by line item of things that you're going to try to cut out of your life. And I almost guarantee that everything that you're going to cut out of your life to save $10,000 is stuff that you genuinely enjoy. You know what I mean? Like, people talk about, oh, I make my own coffee instead of going to Dunkin' Donuts every morning, so I save that $3. It's like, okay, good for you. And don't get me wrong, I'm not hating on fiscally responsible people, but I like going to Dunks. I actually, for some reason, Dunkin' Donuts tastes better when I go get it from Dunkin' Donuts than when I make it at my house. And so if I don't go to Dunks, it's like, okay, I guess I won't do that. All right, I won't take that vacation. I won't buy that thing. So now I'm more miserable versus having the mindset of, life happens for me, I'm going to go get it. How can I figure out how to make $10,000? And that's an important shift that I think not too many people get to, unfortunately.
Wanted to come back to something you mentioned around a lot of people are like going through the motions, which I definitely agree with, and a lot of people are just letting life happen to them. And I think, we're in January at the moment. A lot of people are like changing jobs. There's obviously a bit of a weird market at the moment, and I imagine a lot of people are having interviews or they're like assessing their current job. What do you think are some of the questions people should be asking themselves to establish, like, am I just going through the motions in what I'm doing with my day to day, or is this actually really aligned to like my why, as you called it earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to go through the exercise. I think they have to go through the why and the values exercise. I think the values exercise is easier, and I think it gives you a better guideline. The why, I think, is hard for some people. Like, why do you do what you do? I think, there's a personal and a professional why. But I think that's a maturity thing. The why, right? I mean, if I ask my 12-year-old daughter right now, what's your why? It's like, I think that's a meaningless. You know what I mean? Like, she doesn't know. Even in my 20s, I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. I was just having fun. I was doing my thing. I was moving forward. I was, that type of thing. I think you need a little bit of time to reflect on that. But core values, I think that's one where you can get grounded, and you can use it as a filter to look for opportunities that will support you and your values. So, for instance, I would say to people like if you and I, Michael, have the same core values, okay, or similar core values, then we might argue, we might debate a lot, but we're ultimately going to come to a place of respect and mutual, agreement in some way, shape, or form. We might agree to disagree, but we'll still respect each other for it. But if you and I disagree, if you and I have different values, core values, we're just going to argue. And so for people who are looking for new opportunities right now, and I hope that COVID was an opportunity for everybody to take a step back and realize, what is really important to me? Like, what's really important to me in my life, right? And is going to a job, just sitting in an hour and a half of traffic and, working 8-9 hours a day and then sitting in an hour and a half traffic at home, and is that really what you want to do? Is that aligned with your values? And the answer is usually no. And so by going through that, you can really, self-center on what's truly important to you. And then you can start to look for people and opportunities that align with them and companies that align with them. Because it's so much easier. I even say that from a prospecting standpoint. When my team is we're going, I ask my whole team to come up with their top 50. I want your 50 accounts that you're going to go after this year from a tier 1 standpoint. And I told them, look at the demographic basics of the information, but I also want you to explain to me why you want to work with this company. Like, why you personally picked this company and why they are interesting to you. And if they can't give me a good reason, like, oh man, I love what they're doing, their technology or their leadership or their value, whatever, if they can't give me that answer and it's just, well, they fit the profile, I'm like, then don't go after them. Because going back to the give a shit factor, when you care and you're really genuinely looking, then your messaging, I don't want to say writes itself, but it comes across so much more genuine, and people can pick up on that. And so I think recentering on that why the values, and using that as a check to see what opportunities in people. And then one last piece I'll add to this, which is I put together I've been doing some research on energy management. And a lot of people talk about energy management as it relates to like throughout the day, like when should you do certain things, like do certain things in the morning, whatever it is. That's different than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what gives me energy and what takes energy away from me. And so I have this nice little matrix. On the x-axis is things that help me achieve my goals on the high end, and on the low end is things that do not help me achieve my goals. And on the left-hand side is things that give me or take energy away from me. And on the right-hand side is things that give me energy. And those quadrants, right? Then I put everything in them. Everything. And I mean the tasks that I do, people I talk to, whatever it is. And I put them in one of those buckets. And everything that gives me energy and helps me achieve my goals, I go all in on, right? I really go all in on doing as much of that as I possibly can because I enjoy doing it and it helps me get to where I want to go. The stuff that does not help me, does not give me energy, but helps me get to where I want to go, right? That's where I'm going to either outsource it to somebody else, 4-hour work week, Tim Ferriss, or eat the frog and segment it and do it only 2 hours, whatever. Now, the stuff that does not help me achieve my goals, but gives me energy, those are hobbies. Those are things that are important, right? You need to keep doing those, like travel and whatever for me, and experiences. But man, the stuff that sucks energy away from you and does not help you achieve your goals, if you want time back in your life and you want to live a happier life, put everything in that bucket. And I mean this, unfortunately, about people, friends, family, whatever it is, drugs, alcohol, you know, you name it, right? Put it in there and just cut it off and throw it away. That will help you stay focused on what you like to do that helps you achieve your priorities. And then you line that up with your values and you start to make you start to have an impact, I think.
Yeah, I love that graph you were talking about. I think that's a very useful thing for everyone to do and look at that exercise. Going back to values, which you talked about, so we had a conversation last year, John, and you told me a story that I was quite interested in, which I think would be good for people to listen to now, which was during the pandemic, your life kind of changed because obviously before you were traveling like all around the world, giving these workshops to grow your business, and then you kind of shifted to this work from home model, and kind of your entire business shifted, and it also changed a lot your personal life. So I was wondering if you'd be able to tell the audience that story as well.
Yeah. I mean, before COVID, I was about 2 million miles in less than 10 years, working on my fourth passport. And I was a weekend dad. My daughter's 12 now. So before COVID, 10 years, I was a weekend dad. I would leave on Mondays. I'd come home on Fridays. I'd try to be as present as I possibly could. And I was desperately trying to get off of an airplane, right? Because at first, when I started this company, it was just me. I didn't start this company because I wanted to build a company. I started this company because I didn't want a boss, period. And I never really envisioned hiring and growing, or any of that stuff. So, but when I realized that I was driving, I was flying all over the place, I was like, well, there's really there's no out for me if I don't hire other people here. So I'm always going to be on a plane unless I figure this out. So I started to build, some technology and some platforms and hire some more people and slowly get off of an airplane. But I think at my peak, I probably did 97 days of training, which is, give or take 220 days on the road. And it was going down the year after. It was like 85 and then 70, but it wasn't going as fast as I'd like it to. And COVID changed all that. It forced us to everything. I mean, 90% of our revenue was on-site training, and that shifted everything. And so thankfully for us, I've been kind of planning ahead and looking forward about optimization and everything. So we had an online content that we had released, and we were already set to do remote training. So, we already knew how to do it. So we just shifted it. People just didn't want it up until then. And so it really, it was a blessing for me. I mean, it was probably COVID, and I know this is horrible because it's affected so many people in such a negative way, but COVID, quite frankly, for me, was the best thing that could have ever happened. And it also made me realize that, going back to values, that I was kidding myself a lot of going back to why I was doing what I was doing. I kept telling myself, more importantly than anything, that I was doing this for my family, right? Oh, I'm doing this. Ultimately, the reason I'm working so hard, the reason I'm traveling all over the world is because I'm doing it for my family so that my wife can do it. We can live the life that we want. My daughter can go to school, whatever, right? And after then recentering and going back through the values exercise and the why and everything else, as I was going through it with my business coach, with the value exercise, you take, 50 values, you boil them down to the 15 that you like, and then you go to the 5, and then you prioritize the 5 that are most relevant to you. And family was on the list. And I said to him, when we were prioritizing, I said, well, isn't family kind of the default priority here? Isn't that always the default number one? And he goes, no, absolutely not. He goes, if you want family to be your number one priority, you have to write it down, and you have to ask yourself with every decision you make, how is this going to affect my family? And when he said that, and I sat down and really sat and thought about it, I really was disappointed in myself, because I realized that I wasn't traveling 2 million miles and doing all that stuff for my family. I was pretending, I was telling myself that to feel better. But really, at the end of the day, I was doing it because I was really fucking good at what I did. I mean, there's just something about being the guy. You know what I mean? Like, being able to tell somebody, oh yeah, I flew to Singapore for the day the other day, and I took the red eye home so I could then, stand up in front of 300 people and do a session, and and all the accolades that come with that, and all the praise that come with that. That's a very egocentric approach to what I was doing, even though I was masking it with the family. And so now with COVID and recentering on all this stuff, I reset on my core values, and family is now number one. And so everything I ask myself now, every decision I make is, how's this going to affect my family? And if it's going to affect them in a negative way, I don't do it. So, it's a journey, you know what I mean? Figuring things out. I had values early in my career, and I know I did, but I don't necessarily know if I lived them. I think I just checked off the box. I think I read Think and Grow Rich when I was a kid, and I was like, oh, cool. I'll put some values to there, my principles, and there it is. And I put it on a piece of paper and I shared it with everybody. And then I kind of lived my life, but I never checked it. I never used it as a guideline. I just said, these are my values, right? Now I rewrote them on my whiteboard over here. I stare at them every day. I ask myself the questions as it relates to it. And it's allowed me to be a lot more, I guess, present and purposeful than I have been in the past.
So I wanted to try and get a bit tactical here. So obviously you're fortunate enough you had a business coach who went through this exercise, and it sounded like a really powerful thing because you had this epiphany around just the subject of family as a value and like really breaking that down. But obviously most people listening to this won't have a business coach. So if people are listening to this are like, I want to know what my values are, but I haven't done the exercise yet, how can they go around that, even if it's like 3-4 values?
It's quite, there's tons of it online. Just literally Google core value exercise. There's 50 of them. And usually the way it works is, and I can send people, by the way, if in the show notes, you can give people my email address if they want to see the one I used, but it's just, hey, identify what's important to you. And they give you a list of, like I said, about 50 or 60 core value, like things that are value oriented things. And then you just go through the process of, you highlight which ones resonate with you. And then you get that down to a tighter and tighter and tighter list. And you keep asking yourself the question, does this really important to me? Is this really something that I truly believe? And a good way to actually flip this around is, because a lot of people are like, well, what are my values? Well, an easy way to figure that out is look on the flip side of your values. What do you not like? What do you like? What really makes your blood boil, right? So for instance, if somebody lies to you, does that really bother you? Does that really bother you? You know what I mean? Or is it like, whatever, who cares? If it really bothers you when somebody lies to you, well, then honesty is a core value of yours. If for me, like for instance, and this isn't one of my core ones, but here's a quick example. I find people who are late to meetings, I find it insanely disrespectful to be late for a meeting, okay? I get offended when people are late for meetings because what you're telling me there is you don't respect my time. And I also get very anxious when I'm late for a meeting, right? So for me, timeliness is a show of respect. So respect is a core value of mine, right? Like if I feel like you don't respect me, Michael, like that's going to bother me. That's really going to bother me, right? Authenticity for me, like that goes to lying, right? Authenticity is one of my core values. If you think if you call me out for being a liar, for instance, like I stop everything and I say, whoa, hold on a second. Like what do you think? How do you think I lied? For what reason? And what, you know what I mean? Because I want to be as authentic as I can possibly be. And so those things bother me when people aren't authentic. I hate it when people are up on Instagram and showing how perfect their lives are when I know their lives are a train wreck. I hate quote unquote influencers who are out there spewing shit when they've had 3 years of experience in sales. It's like, and they probably haven't hit their number any of those 3 years. Like that bothers me that people are out there talking about stuff that they probably shouldn't be talking about. But because they're confident on a camera, people are paying attention to them. So those type of things bother me. So therefore, if you look at the things that bother you, you're going to identify the things that are your core values if you don't want to go through the formal exercise.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Kind of flipping it on its head, what really bothers me, and then you can find your values from that. That's cool. Another story that we've talked about, and I've read the article you put together, and I think it'd be great for the listeners to hear this, but just to give a summary, or not a summary, but the title of the article is How Hugging a Tree in Sedona Helped Me Release the Pain of Losing My Dad, and we'll put it in the show notes as well. We'd love for you to talk about this story and this journey you went on.
Yeah, this is actually a full keynote that I've put together on the experience about back in 2000. So again, COVID, best thing that could ever happened. 2020 was actually a pretty good year. I know it sounds horrible, but 2020 was actually a pretty good year for me in general, as messed up as it was. But then 2021 hit, and my dad he had some illness, and nobody could figure it out. And he just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I was waiting for the phone call from my mom. I was hoping not to get it. But my dad's one of those, like, wants to deal with everything by himself. Like, if you tried to go home and take care of him, he would lose his mind, all that stuff. He was from that generation. So, eventually I got a phone call in late January, early February in 2021 that my mom was like, he's really not doing well. You need to come home. And so I dropped everything. And I remember at that moment, we had just signed our biggest customer. Like, we had just signed amazon.com. And I was living in Aruba for 2 months because we were quarantining in Aruba since everything was remote anyways. And we had worked out a super sweet deal with some guy with this Airbnb that nobody had been using. So it was perfect for us. But, and everything was going good. We had signed Amazon. I was doing the training for Amazon across the board. And with the amount of time and logistics, right, to get into doing that training was off the charts. And I got that phone call, and I called up my team, and I said, that's it. I'm done. Cancel everything, give the client their money back, whatever. I'll see you when I see you. And I gave no guidance. I just hung up the phone and got in the airport and went home. Thankfully, I was able to see my dad. So if there's any nurses out there listening to you, I absolutely think you're all angels. This nurse during COVID time allowed my mom, my sister, and myself to go up and see my dad in the ICU right before he passed. And quite frankly, I don't know where I'd be if I didn't see him, because I hadn't seen him in over a year. So it was really, even though he was not in good shape. And I spent a few weeks, dealing with it, mom trying to help clean things up. And then I headed back. And what really struck me was, when I came back, when I tried to plug myself back into the business, I realized that everything was running like a drum. I mean, clients were happy, revenue was there. And it was genuinely the first time in my entire life that I didn't need to be the guy anymore. You know what I mean? For over 10 years, I'd been flying around this world being the number one revenue generator to keep this thing going. And for the first time in my life, I realized, holy smokes, I don't need to be that guy, which really put me in a weird spot because a lot of my self-worth was tied to being the guy and being the number one revenue generator. And it really messed me up. And it set me on a journey for about a year. I was trying to figure out where I fit and really trying to come to grips with my dad and everything else. And after a while, I ended up going to Sedona, which is a place for me that is just, it's where I go to detox. It's Sedona, Arizona. It's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And it's a very spiritual place as well. And I went on this Sedona Soul Adventures where they actually ask you, okay, why are you coming? What are you searching for? What are you trying to deal with? All that stuff. And then they kind of set you up, okay, 2 hours, you're going to go on this soul journey with this person. Then you'll, have the afternoon, and then you go to this person's house and you'll do a palm reading and then whatever. And one of them was a vision quest, and the guy took me to this valley overlooking, and we just started talking about all the different things that were going through my head and my dad, and and how I'd always wished my dad was probably the most interesting person I've ever met in my entire, not probably, he is the most interesting person I've ever known in my life, and also one of the most intelligent people I've ever known, but in a really odd way. And I always felt like if I had just gotten stoned with my dad and had I would have loved to just get stoned with my dad and have like one of those conversations, like a really cool, deep stoner conversation. And he just wasn't that type of person and to open up or any of that stuff. And so as we talked it through, I don't think I have any regrets about my dad because we had a really good relationship. He was also 82 years old, so he lived a pretty good life. But there was just something about the physicalness of, this guy recommended. He's like, well, why don't you go talk to your dad? And I was like, I talked to him a decent amount. He's like, well, why don't you Like that tree right there, when we were in a vortex area, and then this tree had a really cool, funky thing. And he's like, just go talk to him. And at the end of your conversation, give him a hug. And I was like, dude, like, hug a tree? Come on. And he was like, no, just do it. And so I sat there and, had a conversation, and at the end of it gave a hug. And there was just something about the physical nature of that was healing in a lot of ways. And so it did help me come to a resolution with some stuff that I was probably toying around with in my head a little bit more than before. And and it was a great, for me, a very necessary point in my life and my career to kind of move on and get clarity again on where I want to go.
How long after your dad's passing was that you traveled down to Sedona?
About a year. Yeah, it was about a year. Because look, like as much as I said 2020 was a good year for me, 2021 was a horrible year. 2021 was the worst year of my personal life. Not only did my dad pass away, but then after a while, I got fucking kidney stones. I got my cousin who was 62 passed. Like we buried my dad's ashes in September back here in Boston, and I saw my cousin who was 62. I was like, hey, she was good, but she had a cough, and sounded fine, but it was sounded like she was sick. 2 weeks later, find out she had lung cancer that just ripped her apart, and she died within the month. There's a lot of other things. My mom, hip surgery, all sorts of different crazy shit, and so it's just it was a tough year to get through, and there was an epiphany I had a little bit because I hadn't been. I don't want to say I was stuck in neutral, and I don't want to say I was searching, I don't want to say I was lost, but I was definitely searching that whole year. Like, what the fuck does this all mean? And actually, the biggest cathartic and epiphany that I had was when I went to the Amazon. So my daughter every year gets a 2-week vacation in March instead of a week in February. Like here in the States, a week in February and a week in April. For most public schools, my daughter goes to private school and she has 2 weeks in March. So we always take a 2-week vacation. And it was to go to the Galapagos, but part of that was only for 5 days because that was like our bucket list trip. And then we had another 5 days open, and we were going to be down in Ecuador anyway. So my wife decides to go to the Amazon. And to make a very long story short, when I tell you we were in the middle of the Amazon, we were in the middle of the Amazon. I mean, we took a flight to Ecuador and then like another 30-minute little puddle jumper flight to this coca place. And then we took another 30-minute drive to this boat. And then we took a 2-hour drive up the Amazon on this canoe. And then we stopped at another place to get in another canoe without a motor and went another 2 hours into the middle up on this creek. I mean, anacondas, you name it. And as we're walking through the trails and stuff, one of the things that stuck out to my wife, my daughter, and I, independently too, was, when like a tree falls on a trail, right? Usually they take a chainsaw and they just cut the tree to clear the trail. So there was all these trees that had been cut down. And we looked at them and the trunks of them, they looked weird in the middle because they didn't have any rings. Like there was no, trees have rings, right? There was no rings. And so eventually I just asked our guide, I was like, hey, Remy, I just got a curiosity, man. Like, look, all these trees, like none of them have rings. Like, is this a different type of tree that I've never heard of before? And he goes, oh no. He goes, well, like, why don't they have rings? He goes, well, we're in the Amazon. We're on the equator. So there's no seasons. So therefore the trees never stop growing. So therefore there's no rings. And it hit, I was like, holy shit. Like, it was one of those things I never thought of before. Like, oh, trees have rings. That's how you count how old they are, right? But I never thought the reason that trees have rings is because they're seasons, right? They grow and then they stop for a season. Then they grow and then they stop for a season. That's why trees have rings. But on the Amazon, they don't have seasons. So they just keep growing. So that's rattling around in my head. And then we go to the top of the tallest tree in the Amazon and we're looking out over the canopy. There's not a human building in sight. And this is rattling around in my head. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I had stopped growing. I was stuck in neutral. And then after that, I came back and I became obsessed with getting back on track and moving in the right direction. And that's where Sedona came in. Because I was like, you know what? This is the place that I go to cleanse whatever is ailing me in spiritually in a lot of ways. And I needed those 3 days by myself. I did not come with my wife and daughter. It was just me. And it was a very, very healthy and important thing for me in that part of my life.
Yeah, so I was reading the article again just before the podcast, and I actually was thinking about the fact that you went by yourself, and obviously it was almost this like pilgrimage that you did after what happened to you, and listening to that story now of how you went to the Amazons. So how come you did that by yourself? Why did you think it was important that you did that journey on your own?
Because if you can't, you're never going to be good for anybody else unless you can, be good for yourself. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like the old adage, like, you can't love anybody else unless you love yourself, right? And some people think that's egocentric, and that's not. Okay, it might be, but it's true, right? If you don't genuinely love yourself, there's no possible way you could genuinely love somebody else. And so for me, it was important for me to go work on myself so I could be a better person for my family, so I could be a better person for everybody else around me. And so that's why I think it was really, really important to be by myself and be, look, I mean, everybody needs help. Everybody needs help, whether it's therapy, whether it's whatever. And I don't think it's bad to admit that. And I think it's important to identify it. And for me, it was important to identify it by myself and work on some shit that I knew I had to get through before I could come back and be a better dad, be a better husband, and everything else.
Yeah, 100% agree. And definitely don't think it's selfish to love yourself first. As you said, that's where the love for others comes from. Question I wanted to ask you, and it's kind of like the essence really of this podcast. So you're obviously running a very successful business, JB Sales, and you're materially abundant in that side. And then you've also got this spiritual side, like you said, you've gone to Sedona and you see yourself as spiritual. How can you balance those two things? And I really think this is an eternal question. I don't think we ever find the answer to this, but like in your life at the moment, how do you balance those two sides?
I think it's I think there's things. Well, I'll say how I do it, not how I necessarily recommend others do it. But I think it's a constant like grounding of why and values, but also then sitting down and really looking at, from a priority standpoint, what do you need to do? Where do you want to go, right? And what do you need to accomplish? Because at certain points, it is important to work your ass off and stay up into, what I mean, to get to a certain point in your career, but you can't sustain that, right? So at certain stages of certain people's lives, your priorities change. My priorities changed. For 10 years, it was go out and make as much money as I possibly could and build a business so that, I could eventually live the life that I want to live. And now it's much more family driven and everything else. So I think it's a constant, beginning of the year is a great time to say, okay, this year, what do I want to accomplish? And let's look 5 years out. And have that conversation. I mean, how many people have the conversation with their significant other about their dual goals, like husbands and wives? Like, when's the last time a family sat down and said, okay, family, in 5 years, like, what do we want to be? Like, where do we want to be? And if you have that alignment of an agreement of where you want to get to, and by the way, this can always change, and it should, right? Because stuff comes up. I've never been like a hardcore goal setter, like let me put this stake in the ground and everything to go for it. I'm more of an evolutionist, but you need a guiding light. And so I think if by going through the values exercise, the why exercise, that's going to ground you to a certain degree. But then you need to understand, okay, well, what am I based on that? What are my life goals? What are my priorities from a lifestyle standpoint? And, maybe look 3-4 years out, something like that, and then back into it. Because a lot of people ask, I get a lot of reps who will say, hey, John, I'm looking at, maybe leaving this job and going to another one, and, any suggestions? And I said, well, okay, yeah, sure. Well, what's your plan? And they're like, what do you mean? I go, 5 years out. That dumb question we always get in the interview, like, what's your 5-year plan? Like, I want to be a manager. Shut up. That's not the answer. I used to think it was a dumb question. Now I think it's a really important question, but it's not about where you want to be with that business. It's where do you want to be in your life 5 years from here, right? Lifestyle wise, like, do you want to own a house? Do you want to be married? Do you want to, whatever it is, right? And I think that's important. That's why your values are first, because that's going to help you determine those. and then you back into it. And because look, at the end of the day, if I'm doing a job right now that I just really can't stand, but I know that by doing this job, it's going to get me to that next step, that's going to ultimately get me to the next step, that's going to help me achieve what I want to achieve, then I will eat a shit sandwich today all day long, and I will work 18 hours a day. I will work 20 hours, to get there. But if I don't know where I'm going, or if I don't know what I want, then I'm just going to go from shit sandwich to shit sandwich trying to taste a better one. And they're all going to taste like shit. It's just one might taste a little bit better. And again, going back to life happens for me versus to me. If life happens for you, then you go and say, what do I want to accomplish? What do I want to do? And then how does that align with my values? And then how can I get there? And that's how I think you can balance the spirituality versus the reality, if you will, of it. Because to your point, when we talked previously, if you go too far one side or the other, it's probably not going to work out for you. Now, I will say that I can tell there's plenty of people that I've met in Sedona that literally lived the corporate life and then went to Sedona and said, holy shit, and now all of a sudden are a shaman or something like that and live a great spiritual life doing what they want. So you'd say that was pretty far on the spiritual side, but they're living the life and they're happy. And that's probably the last point I'll make is on this topic is, look, the ultimate goal for everybody should be happiness. That doesn't mean millions of dollars. I mean, to some people it might. It's happiness. I mean, again, I'll go back to Gary Vee. He says, if you make 40 grand a year, if you make $40,000 a year, which most people in today's world would like in the B2B space, especially in the tech space, I say, oh, I make $40,000. They'd probably laugh at you, right? But if you make $40,000 a year and you go to work 9 to 5 and you enjoy your work and you get to go home and play with your kids and take them to Little League and stuff like that, and you are genuinely happy, you win. You win. I know millionaires who are miserable pricks. I'd much rather work with hang out with my buddy who's a contractor and makes 40, 50 G's a year, but loves life. You know what I mean? So I think happiness is the definition, is the goal. And you just have to define what happiness means for you. And I think once you really define what happiness means for you, you can find that balance between spirituality and work.
I think that's a great way to end the show, John. We'll put a link to JB Sales, your LinkedIn profile, the Sedona article as well. Is there anywhere else you'd like to send anyone listening to this?
I mean, look, we got a ton of free resources here. We just rebranded to Sell Better XYZ. So Sell Better by JB Sales, and I think our website, Sell Better XYZ. But if you go to YouTube and check out Sell Better XYZ, you'll get a ton of free content. And then if anybody has any questions for me or anything I can help with, Instagram's the best way to connect with me on because that's where I do a ton of free consulting. I'll answer any question that people have, and my handle's John M as in Michael Barrows. And that's the same thing on TikTok and Twitter and everything else. But Instagram's the one I focus most of my efforts on as far as support is concerned.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, John. Been a great chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Michael. I appreciate it.
Really amazing chat today with my friend John, and some good takeaways that I liked was think about, are you really doing this for your family or are you doing it for your ego? Because sometimes you mix the two together. And the second one related to happiness, right? The person who's earning 40 grand but radiates love and happy and makes other people happy, they're going to be a much better person to be around than someone that's making millions and is miserable all the time. So that's a great thing to think about. And don't forget to subscribe to us on all your favorite podcast channels and also YouTube. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode.